Okay, I want to talk now about more information that you would need, additional information you would need to do a dynamic assessment, particularly with, or specifically really, with individuals who are bilingual or bidialectic. And we have really not spoken about that yet in any detail. So let's think a little bit about the kinds of information you would need in an evaluation with an individual who was, again, bilingual, that is, individuals who speak or understand 2 or more languages, or dialects. And let me say this, there is research to show that dialect differences within a language can cause issues, could raise issues very similar to bilingualism in children. Reem Dakwar's work definitely demonstrates that. So we want to keep that in mind. These are some of the information you need to address in an assessment with a child who is bilingual. Now, before I move ahead, some of you may be ready to push the button and turn this part of the lecture off, or this lecture off, because you say to yourself, I am monolingual, and therefore, what do I need to know about bilingualism? Well, you may be the person doing an evaluation with a child who is bilingual, even though you're monolingual, because bilingual clinician is not available. Or you may be treating a client who is bilingual because they have not been assigned to a bilingual intervention. But still, the issues related to bilingualism and doing a dynamic assessment and making a differential diagnosis require that we monolinguals be familiar with aspects of bilingualism and how they might impact speech and language performance, and really what's involved in bilingualism and bidialectism, especially in a school setting. So, with that in mind, I'm going to give an overview here. You'll go into way more depth on this in the 2 Bilingual Foundations courses by 603, which deals with more with African American dialect, and 604, which deals with bilingualism and particularly bilingual language development and simultaneous and sequential bilinguals, and assessing that and the implications, again, for education. So in any event, let me start with the first bit of information you need, and that is the language history of your client. You need to know if the client is a simultaneous bilingual or diglossic, that is a person who speaks more than one dialect, a simultaneous bilingual, or a sequential bilingual. By simultaneous bilingual, we mean an individual who has acquired 2 languages at about the same time, either as an infant or or toddler. Well, really not either as, really basically as an infant or a toddler has developed 2 languages simultaneously, and also is presently living or in a context in which the 2 languages are supported, continue to be valued and experienced. Simultaneous bilingual. A sequential bilingual is an individual who has learned a language at one time and has come into a setting where the individual is acquiring a second language. Now, that setting may be one that continues to support expression and comprehension of the original language, use of the original language, in other words, L1, or it may be a setting where the L1 is not focused on anymore, and that the entire focus of communication is through, the entire process of communication is through L2, the new language. So we have simultaneous bilingualism and sequential bilingualism. You have to determine where your client, what type of bilingual your client might represent. If the client is a simultaneous bilingual, the question is there a dominant language? Is one of the two or more languages, by the way, that may be trilingual or more, or even more lingual, more multilingual? You would be asking, you need to determine which language is dominant. Typically, even in simultaneous bilinguals who have acquired two languages at the same time, one language is often stronger or more dominant than the other. So is there a dominant language or not? And if not, are the languages balanced? Is there a balanced knowledge of the two languages? If the client is a sequential bilingual, you need to know L1, the language the child initially acquired, and L2, the age at which the new language second language has been introduced. And then you have to, learn whether the client is operating in a context that is supportive of bilingualism, L1 and L2, in which both can be used and are being experienced, or whether the focus is on just L2, the new language, and there's language loss occurring in the area of L1. And then, with reference to whether the client is a simultaneous bilingual or a sequential bilingual, and by the way, let me say one more thing, you may be meeting a client who is in the stage we're dealing with in this course on assessment. I tend to focus on younger children and children of school age who are still developing language, but you may have a client in whom language has been already developed. The languages are developed in an adolescent or adult, because in other words, you may be working with a client or evaluating a client in process of developing language, two languages, or one new language. Developing one new language while another two languages remaining stable or continuing to develop, or learning one language where the other language the L1 is being lost. You may be assessing in process of language acquisition or language loss. Having said that, then your job is to identify the stage of language development that the child is at, but that concerns either simultaneous language development or acquisition of L2 and functioning in L1. What happens as children acquire a second language, they go through a stage of development called, or a process, or develop a language that's state of language that's called an interlanguage, and it's a language form, content and use really, that is intermediate between beginning to learn a new language and being competent in L1 and finally becoming more and more competent in L2. That interlanguage reflects the developing competence in L2. And L2 will be developing from a social level of language ultimately to an academic level, hopefully, because the child must reach an academic level to fully be able to function in a school setting in an optimal way in their L2, in their new language, if the child is a sequential bilingual and is acquiring a new language. And you need some information about mixing, that is, whether the child is mixing in some way in single utterances or in their communication, their L1 and L2. You need language history in these areas. You also need language history as it relates to the context in which the child finds him or herself, and the attitude of the context to the languages that the child is speaking or acquiring or losing. And those contexts, I identify 3 contexts that you need to learn about, and that is the home context, the school context, and the peer context. And in these 3 contexts, you need to learn whether they are how supportive they are of the languages and the attitudes towards the languages that the child is, or dialects that the child is learning or using. So at home, you basically want to understand, is the child experiencing an additive environment or a subtractive environment? Particularly, again, if we're talking about a sequential bilingual who's acquiring an L2 in a new, usually in a place of living, new country that the child has found himself in or herself in, or a new neighborhood, again, if the child is bidialectic. An additive context, an additive situation is one in which L1 is being supported, or dialect 1 is being supported, that is used, the child is free to use it, and actually the dialect or language is favored, that is looked at positively, the L1, the dialect 1. And in addition to that, the new dialect and the new language is also valued in this context and being acquired and supported. That is an additive environment where 2 languages or dialects are supported and valued and used. Now, of course, the home environment could be subtractive, and that's one in which the focus is entirely on the new L2 language or dialect, and the L1 language is no longer favored, no longer focused on, no longer used, and therefore is in process, and that would suggest it's ultimately in process of loss. Now, the school environment. The question is, what languages are spoken in, or dialects are spoken in school, and what kind of a program is the child in? Let me say a few words about school and bilingualism, particularly, well, bilingualism, simultaneous or sequential. The bilingual child who is in process of developing language really has 2 jobs to do. And that is to develop their language, to go through language development. That's our domain, not speech-language pathologists. And also to use the language of the school setting to learn. And by learn, I mean not simply learn language, but learn math, science, social studies, etc. Language is being acquired then, and is being used to learn. Therefore, it's very important to understand whether the school environment is a monolingual or bilingual one. Is the child learning in L1 and L2 in their 2 languages, or just in one language? Is that one language the L1, which may be the dominant language of the child, particularly if the child is an immigrant and has just come to the United States and has experienced school in another language and has academic competency in their L1? Is the child learning in that L1? Or does the child have to learn in L2, in their new language? Same thing in terms of dialect. Is the dialect in school anything like the dialect at home? What are the differences, and what dialect is the child learning? Likely not the dialect of the dialect at home if the child is from a minority background. At least often the dialects are not the same. Now, is the child may be in a monolingual learning environment in school. The child may be in a bilingual learning environment in school. My children, we've moved out here to Long Beach, New York, because there was a bilingual immersion program out here where our kids were supposed to be learning math, science, social studies, both in English and in Spanish, actually. They had a Spanish immersion program out here. Unfortunately, that program just disappeared over the years. But that is another kind of school program where L1 and L2 are fully supported academically, so that the child would be able to learn about math, science, social studies in their dominant L1 language and also in their new language. Both languages would be supported. It would be an additive school environment, as I see it. Does the child learn in a monolingual school environment, primarily L2, but receive second language instruction as well? Or does the child learn in L1 in a bilingual situation and receive second language instruction in L2? And you need to know in school, as at home, is the attitude towards the heritage language, the child's L1. Is that valued or devalued? Is the attitude one that values the child's, again, heritage language, L1, or devalues it? Heritage dialect, or not, or devalues it. Now there's a third environment, whoops, that I'm looking at I'm using my, I've just messed up my, I'm going to stop here for a second. Now, as a parent, I am aware that there is a third context that is very critical in language, understanding a child's language status. That is a child who is bilingual, particularly a child who is bilingual or bidialectic, and that is the peer environment. And very much what the child's friends value become what our children value. What their friends and peers devalue become what our children devalue, regardless of what the home environment says about things or feels about things, or maybe in spite of it, and especially regardless or in spite of what the school is trying to promulgate. So is the peer environment, does a child with peers who are monolingual and speak the language L1, or bilingual and speak L1 or L2, or monolingual speaking only L2? And again, what are the peers' attitude towards the child's heritage language or dialect? Are they respectful of that language? Is it cool? Is L1 cool? Is it valued or devalued? L2, cool, valued or devalued? Mixing. The child mixes, that is, uses combinations of the languages. Is mixing cool or not cool? My kids also have some exposure to Korean. They're both Taekwondo black belts, believe it or not. Given the father here, I would say it's hard to believe, but yes, genetics in some cases doesn't play out, or at least their mother's genetics played out, and maybe not, and not particularly mine. They are black belts. In any event, as part of their Taekwondo training, they do learn some Korean, and they're in fact very interested in, particularly my younger, in Korean culture. In any event, their peers are very, first of all, many of their peers are Korean, and many of their friends, and the whole business of mixing languages is important to them, and it's very valued, and they even listen to music, Korean bands that perform by mixing English and Korean. It's a very interesting scene here. In any event, the attitude towards mixing, towards the languages by the peers are very important and will have an impact on the child's language performance. Now, I'm going to go speak a little bit about principles of language development, first in simultaneous bilingual children, and then monolingual. You need to know about the course of language development in simultaneous bilingualism and sequential bilingualism to be able to do a differential diagnosis of a speech-language problem or of a language learning pattern, distinguishing that from a speech-language problem, which you may have to do if your client is a child who is bilingual. It's bilingual children who are simultaneous bilinguals. That is, children who are exposed to two languages simultaneously from birth. They develop two separate but interconnected language systems. Two separate but interconnected language systems. Implications for assessment. You have to assess the children in two languages with reference to developmental norms in the areas of content, form, and use that correspond to each language. That is, you have to assess the children in the two languages, one independently from the other. Let me say this, that whether the child is sequential or simultaneous bilingual, we do have techniques for evaluating children in the two languages. One technique is to provide, to have two clinicians available, two diagnosticians available in the assessment. One who speaks English exclusively and doesn't understand a word of the L2, and another who speaks L2 exclusively and doesn't, at least pretends to the child, not to speak a word of L2, or comprehend, by the way, or understand a word of L1, L2, depending on the person, at all. So you have one person who speaks L1 and understands L1 exclusively, a person who understands L2 and speaks L2 exclusively. And each one of these individuals alone would collect a language sample from the client, speaking only their exclusive language, their monolingual language. And children have a tendency and an ability typically to sense, to detect what languages their interlocutors speak and understand, typically based on the understanding responses. And then they code switch the kids. So they'll speak to the person speaking one language in that language, and the monolingual speaking the L2 in that language. They'll code switch. That's what we want to see, and that's what we try to get. The other thing we do is operate with in a assess children, take standard norm referenced assessments and present them in a non-standard administration, and again work with each evaluator presenting the assessment in the language, L1, one language or the other, L1 or L2. And In some cases, there are standard norm reference assessments that have been translated, and so there are two versions of the assessment. So a Spanish version would be given, and then an English version if the child was a bilingual. Yeah, I spoke Spanish and English, but unfortunately, there are not standard norm reference assessments that have been normed in languages other than English and Spanish that I'm aware of. At least we don't have them available here, and I have not seen them in my travels. So we keep that in mind. In any event, some principles. Number one, children exposed to two languages simultaneously from birth develop two separate but interconnected linguistic systems, so you must evaluate in the two languages, both in the non-standard and standard assessments. Principle, the rate of language development of bilingual children is sensitive to their exposure time to each language at home. So you have to determine exposure characteristics through caregiver interview and observation. As I said, do not presume a developmental delay as a consequence of learning two languages simultaneously. That is, learning two languages simultaneously is not a contributing factor to a language delay. And you have to determine the dominance of, it is the case that even in simultaneous bilinguals, in simultaneous bilingual language development, there is a dominance of one language over a second language, over another language. One of the languages tends to be dominant. Implications for assessment. Identify language dominance through caregiver interaction and language screening. Test the children in their dominant language. Control for mismatches between children. Then control for mismatches between the clinicians. Mismatches between the clinicians' language characteristics and the child's dominance. That is, you want to be communicating with the child at the level of development that the child is at, in their dominant language and in their language that is not dominant, non-dominant language. There will be a different level of reference or level of communication there. Code mixing. Code mixing, which has to do with the child's use of more than one language in a communication. Bilingual code mixing is a typical pattern of managed language use among bilingual children and adults. Code mixing is manifested by typically achieving children and children with language disabilities. It is typical. Bilingual code mixing is not a sign of language delay. Parents should never be advised to use only one language with a typically achieving child, or a child diagnosed as language delay or impaired. It is not unusual for speech-language pathologists evaluating a child or giving kind of off-the-cuff advice to parents who are concerned about their child's language development and who are bilingual to advise parents to speak to their child only in one language and stop using the other language. That's horrible advice from many perspectives. It certainly damages the parent. It has the potential to damage, I have nightmare stories to tell about this, quite frankly, damage the parent-child relationship. If one of the parents, one parent is, or both parents, are fluent, most fluent, their dominant language is an L1, and not the language that the child is, that's being, or the dialect that's being spoken primarily in school, being taught, used to teach in school. So, in the interest of learning in school, supposedly, the client, the parents are advised, don't use your L1. And if one parent needs to use L1 to communicate in effectively with their child, emotionally with their child, to connect with their kid, and they're concerned about doing it, the parent-child interaction will be damaged, potentially, and boy, that's not good. Don't advise. Don't make that kind of advice. Principle: code mixing, in fact, is a sign of linguistic resourcefulness and often sensitivity by the child to the linguistic and communicative norms of the context in which the child finds themselves. So don't interfere with code mixing or view it negatively, but instead provide monolingual alternatives to code mixing in a dynamic manner. In other words, model perhaps to the child what is acceptable or more valued in one context or more effective in one context or another. So model to the child. And if the child often code mixes because they have not yet acquired vocabulary or phrases in their L2, model alternative vocabulary or phrases. Provide language enrichment when there are gaps in knowledge of a language, as opposed to stepping on the code mixing. And code mixing is shaped by social norms, as I said. Investigate the contexts of that the child experiences at home and school and with the peers. And don't penalize children for differences with monolingual communicative standards. Help a child who is a sequential bilingual adjust to their new setting. Okay, a few words about stages of sequential bilingualism, the development of sequential bilingualism. Stage 1, home language, where the child uses only the L1 from that the child knows, of course. Stage 2 is a nonverbal stage where the child may be intimidated about using a new language that they're just beginning to acquire. So that in a school setting, when they're in a setting with monolingual children or teachers from, or children or teachers who are speaking a new L2, the child may be reticent to speak. Then comes the stage of formulaic language, where the child may have some phrases that they've picked up that work, like cool. Would they like something, they heard the term cool, they might say that'll be using that word, or that's cool or good, or I like it, or can I have, to get something. Some phrases or another, if you've traveled, you may have had that experience. If you've got a phrase and you'll use it and fill in the words, or the can I have and with a pointing or something like that. Formulaic language. Productive telegraphic speech is another phase that follows a formulaic phase, where the child hasn't yet learned about how to really assign case, use function words in the new language, but has content words, the nouns and verbs. So you'll hear again more telegraphic speech that is not fully integrated with the function words that assign case, articles and things like that. It then develops an interlanguage, and that goes through stages where the child, that's when the child is code mixing and developing a new language, and developing first a social competence in the new language, which involves being able to hang out and speak with friends, or in school, being able to carry out cursory conversations and understand information and produce language at a certain level, but that is not academic competence. That's not an academic level of language, which takes way longer to develop. I believe in the literature up to 7 years to develop academic competence in language. And what does that mean? That means being able to use academic vocabulary in the areas, the subject areas, math, science, social studies, or at the university level. Academic competence is being able to use professional terminology in speech-language pathology when you speak and write. You'll look at the rubric for your diagnostic report. One of the areas is lexicon, professional vocabulary. That's academic language and speech-language pathology. There's a difference between social language and academic. On your reports, I'll say colloquial. Colloquial. That means you're using social language as opposed to academic language. And to really learn at a high level, you need academic language. So that's something to keep in mind, a reason, in fact, why bilingual immersion programs are very, very important and really the way to go when it comes to learning, but not favored often in communities around the United States. In any event, you need to know the characteristics of these stages of language development, a second language development in a sequential bilingual, to distinguish between a language disorder or delay and a language learning issue related to becoming bilingual language development, because that's not a problem. Bilingual language development is not a problem. These stages of language development are not problems. Telegraphic speech, formulaic language could be a problem in a monolingual who's should be functioning, say, at Leahy Phase 8 with basically a complete language system. Telegraphic speech, formulaic language would be a problem in that sort of, say, a school-age child, 6, 7, 8, and up. But for a child developing a new language, acquiring a second language, those are typical stages. They're signs of competence, and they're important. They're important. They lay the foundation. They're the foundation of acquiring a new language and becoming competent, and they're normal, typical. So you have to be aware of this, and then your job would be to distinguish between characteristics of a language delay and characteristics of learning a new language, and that can be challenging at times. Again, it requires that you evaluate the child in the two languages. You may have to do that by working with if you're not bilingual yourself but are monolingual, you might need to work with another clinician who speaks the child's L2. If you are bilingual, you'll be working in the two languages, or you may in fact have to work with somebody else if you yourself are dominant in one language or another and are having trouble assessing the child in their less dominant language. I just used a parent. We just did an evaluation, and then I used a translator. The translator was the child's mom, and the child's mom was translating into Mandingo. Actually, it was a child who had experience and was exposed on a continuous basis to English, French, and Mandingo. So we evaluated in two of those three languages. That's pretty much what I have to say right now. Maybe a couple of things about the interlanguage I see I have on the next slide here, and some characteristics of the interlanguage include phonologic patterns, developmental patterns, strategies such as the use of general all-purpose verbs, do or got, etc., that can be substitute for a variety of verbs. They make quote-unquote errors of omission. They're not really errors, but there are strategies, or they are in between stages in transitioning from one language to another, or developing a second language while you're maintaining your first, omitting articles, irregular tense forms, markers for number agreement that are typical for an interlanguage and problematic in a child with a delay. Errors of commission, overgeneralizing regular tense patterns. Often there's transfer from L1 to L2, that is, characteristics of L1 apply to L2, particularly when there is an overlap in the characteristics, typically. Phonological patterns, morphosyntax, morphological forms could be transferred from L1 to L2. Client may at times avoid L2 forms, may use awkward forms, and go through a process of bilingual bootstrapping using knowledge of one language to facilitate acquisition of a second. So Okay, that's as far as I want to go now. You hear the dog barking in the background. I think they're signaling to me that I've spoken enough for the time being. I will be back a little later with some additional lecture components. Code mixing that includes intra-utterance. Within an utterance, a child, an individual may use words or phrases that are from one language or the other, both together in one utterance. Or it may be one utterance is expressed in one language and a second utterance in a second language. Since I'm monolingual, I'm not very good at demonstrating this. If you are bilingual or have bilingual colleagues, you could listen or have this demonstrated. I would maybe try to add to this video some examples of this for you. You might find that the mixing is on the level of a word, so a word of one language is substituted for a word of the second language as the second language is being used, or as the first language is being used. Otherwise, it's entirely one language being expressed. A phrase can be substituted. It's usually phrase boundaries that are maintained in code mixing, or clauses, clause boundaries, or pragmatic patterns, that is, social rules of one language are being transferred or used in utterances that are being expressed in terms of content and form in the second language or first language. A couple of words about the principles of dual language development and their implications for the assessment of speech-language function. In identifying the dominant language, you pay attention to things like MLU, mean length of utterance, rate of appearance of advanced morphophonemic structures, the proportion of different word types. Does the child use only one verb or two verbs generally, or in one noun, or thing, or this, or that, general pronouns? Or does the child have use multiple vocabulary items, a varied lexicon? Frequency of pauses, hesitations during expression, volubility, that is amount of speaking that occurs in one language or the other, and the proportion of code switching in each language. It's not the code switching or code mixing. Code switching, by the way, is going from one to another language. Code mixing is mixing the languages and within phrases, within utterances or across utterances, the proportion of one language to the other. And both L1 and L2 should be evaluated in terms of content, form, and use. Don't forget, content, form, and use, and all the subcomponents, phonology, morphology, syntax. Each of those have to be evaluated in the two languages.